In Indonesia, an invisible yet highly influential line runs between the islands of Bali and Lombok. Known as the Wallace Line, it is named after British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who discovered this unique division over 150 years ago. Despite being a theoretical boundary rather than a physical one, the Wallace Line creates a stark separation in species on either side. Just 35 kilometers apart, the ecosystems of Bali and Lombok are so different that they appear almost as if they belong to separate continents. The animals on Bali's side of the Wallace Line are predominantly of Asian origin, with species like tigers, monkeys, and elephants. Just across the narrow strait on Lombok, however, the wildlife resembles that of Australia, with marsupials such as kangaroos, the fascinating Komodo dragon, and various other reptiles. Remarkably, birds, animals, and even fish do not seem to cross this boundary, creating an ecological divide that feels like an invisible wall, though it exists only in biological patterns rather than in visible form. The early life and discoveries of Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was born in England in 1823 to a modest family. From an early age, he was passionate about nature, science, and exploration. His father, a cartographer, frequently traveled to make maps, and Wallace often accompanied him, gaining exposure to the world's landscapes, which helped spark his lifelong curiosity about biodiversity. Although Wallace had limited formal education due to financial constraints, he became a self-taught naturalist through his travels and observations. His interest in nature deepened as he studied different plants, insects, and animals wherever he went, diligently recording his observations in journals. In 1854, Wallace embarked on an ambitious journey to the Malay Archipelago, a region encompassing today's Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. His goal was to study and collect specimens of plants and animals to understand more about species and their distribution. Throughout his travels, he gathered thousands of samples of plants, birds, and insects, sending them back to Europe for study. As Wallace moved from island to island, he began noticing patterns in the types of species he encountered, eventually leading him to his groundbreaking discovery. The discovery of the Wallace Line. One of the most striking patterns Wallace observed was the dramatic difference in animal species between the islands of Bali and Lombok. He found that animals on Bali shared similarities with those found across the Asian continent, including species like tigers and leopards. When he crossed over to Lombok, however, he was astonished to find animals more characteristic of Australia, such as marsupials, cockatoos, and the formidable Komodo dragon. Wallace noticed that the birds on these islands also seemed unique to each region. Bali's bird species resembled those of the Asian mainland, while Lombok's bird species were more similar to those in Australia. This sharp division puzzled him, as Bali and Lombok are geographically close, separated only by a narrow stretch of ocean. Wallace's observations led him to hypothesize that some kind of natural boundary separated the Asian and Australian fauna, even if he couldn't see or measure it. Understanding the barrier of the Wallace Line. At the time, Wallace could not fully explain why animals from the two sides of the Wallace Line did not migrate or intermingle. He didn't know about tectonic plates or continental drift, which were not yet scientific concepts in the 19th century. Yet, his observations laid the groundwork for what would later be understood as one of the key principles in biogeography. Modern science has provided more clarity on the Wallace Line. Millions of years ago, the continents of Asia and Australia were closer together and part of a supercontinent. Over time, tectonic plate movements slowly pulled the two landmasses apart, creating a deep sea barrier between them. As sea levels rose, the water between Asia and Australia formed channels and seas that were difficult for most land animals and non-migratory birds to cross. This barrier also limited gene flow between populations, resulting in distinct evolutionary paths on either side. The Wallace Line falls in a tectonically active region, where the powerful ocean currents run through the narrow strait between Bali and Lombok. These currents are so strong that even fish and other marine species have difficulty crossing, creating a rare underwater boundary that contributes to the species differences on either side. Wallace had noted this, although he didn't have the technology to measure the currents as scientists do today. The impact of the Wallace Line on modern science. Wallace's discovery of this boundary was revolutionary for its time and helped shape modern biogeography, the study of the geographic distribution of species. His observations on species distribution and natural selection significantly influenced scientific thought. Wallace even independently developed a theory of evolution through natural selection, similar to that of Charles Darwin. Although Darwin is often credited as the father of evolutionary theory, Wallace's work is equally vital and recognized in scientific history. Today, scientists understand that the Wallace Line is part of a broader pattern of species distribution influenced by plate tectonics, ocean currents, and geographical isolation. This invisible line remains one of the most striking examples of how nature creates boundaries, even without physical barriers. The ongoing fascination with the Wallace Line. The Wallace Line is still a subject of fascination for researchers and biologists around the world. It's a reminder of how the forces of nature, like tectonic shifts and ocean currents, can create distinct ecosystems even in neighboring regions. The invisible boundary between Bali and Lombok offers a unique glimpse into the mechanisms of evolution and geographic isolation, helping scientists understand how species evolve differently based on their environments. In recent years, new research has shown that other invisible barriers may exist around the world, marking natural divisions in biodiversity. However, the Wallace Line remains one of the most famous and well-studied examples, representing a fascinating natural divide that continues to captivate scientists and the public alike. Wallace's journey to discover this line was not only a testament to his curiosity and perseverance but also a foundation for our understanding of biodiversity. Today, the Wallace Line serves as a lasting tribute to Alfred Russel Wallace's contributions to science, reminding us that sometimes the most profound discoveries lie in the patterns hidden within the natural world. Balaj 33868 at suitxt.com